as your rhetorical choice, as a rhetorical choice. You have multiple that you need to talk about. So let's do an activity, and then we'll return to that passage and try to find some in that passage. Before we do, though, let's just kind of practice with identifying rhetorical strategies. So each of these two, I used one of these rhetorical strategies above. I wrote these using one of these strategies. Try to identify which one I used. So we'll do the first one first, and then, pause, do it, we'll talk about it, and then we'll do the second one after. So go ahead, take a look at this first one. Try to find out which rhetorical strategy I used, and then I'll explain which one I used. Okay, so it says, the tea tax laws infuriated the Sons of Liberty, and they intended to let the British government know. On December 16, 1773, they boarded British ships and dumped chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This act of defiance would become known as the Boston Tea Party. All right, so this rhetorical strategy that I used to write this is narration. I'm telling a story about what happened, right? I'm narrating the events that took place around the Boston Tea Party. Go ahead and take a look at the second one, see if you can figure out the second one. Okay, so the second one says, increasing the federal minimum wage would be a crushing blow to small businesses in less populated areas. Their income is limited, and having to pay their employees a higher wage would force many businesses to raise the price of their goods and services, lay off a percentage of their staff, or even cease operations completely. And the rhetorical strategy I used here was cause and effect, right? I am demonstrating what would happen in a situation where the federal minimum wage was increased, right? That would be the cause, and the effect would be the three things I mentioned. Raise the prices of their goods and services, lay off a percentage of their staff, or cease operations completely. It's conveying information by saying, here's the cause, here are some effects that will happen if that cause happens. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of these strategies and what they look like. Now we're going to practice with that passage that we looked at earlier. So you guys are already familiar with this passage. You've read through it twice by this point. I'm going to have you read through it a third time here. And look out for these strategies. See how many you can identify. Again, it says identify one. If you can identify more, awesome. Definitely do that. But identify at least one, and then if you do identify more, pick one and explain what the effect of it is, or what the purpose of it is, one of the two. So yeah, give this video a pause and unpause when you're done. Okay, I found two of them. These are the two that I found. Let me make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So the first one I found was definition in lines 26 to 40. We talked about this already with the rhetorical question and also the repetition. She says, for what is good journalism all about? And then she goes on to tell the audience what good journalism is all about. On a working finite level, it is the effort to achieve illuminating candor in print and strip away all can. It is the effort to do not only this, blah, 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 blah. Right? This whole paragraph is defining good journalism. It's telling the audience what good journalism is, and what she considers good journalism to be. That's definition. And the reason she does this is to make it clear to the audience what she means by good journalism, and also emphasizing the idea of good journalism. And the other one I found was compare and contrast, lines 1 to 5. I am happy to, you could know. I am happy and flattered to be a guest of honor on this always exciting and challenging occasion. But looking over this audience tonight, I am less happy than you might think, and more challenged than you could know. The author establishes how occasions like the current one make her feel, then provides a contrast to how the current situation makes her less happy and more challenged than usual. So she's comparing the way that these sorts of events normally make her feel to how this particular one makes her feel, right? And the reason she does this is to emphasize the fact that she is not happy to be criticizing, and also finds it very challenging to be doing that. She emphasizes those ideas by comparing it to how these sorts of events normally make her feel. Those are the two that I could find. Again, if you found more, awesome. And hopefully you were able to find at least one in here. Again, rhetorical strategies, one type of rhetorical choice that you can write about in your essay if you are able to identify them. And again, I want to reiterate before we move on to the next idea that a rhetorical choice does not have to be a rhetorical strategy or a rhetorical device. It can be anything else as well, as long as you can identify what the effect or purpose of that choice is. And additionally, rhetorical strategies are another thing that you can implement into your own writing, the same way you can implement rhetorical devices into your own writing. So speaking of purposes or effects, let's talk about finding a common idea, purpose, or effect. We talked about how your thesis is supposed to state all your rhetorical choices and what they achieve, and that they should all have something in common, right? That they all achieve. That's what we're talking about here. A rhetorical analysis essay is much more than just a list of a writer's rhetorical choices. You also need to analyze each choice, and there should be some common idea, purpose, or effect that links all of the rhetorical choices that you write about in your essay. There's something that holds all the choices together, right? They have some common idea, some common purpose, or some common effect. Something that they all share. And once you identify this common idea, purpose, or effect, it should be stated in your thesis, right? As we looked at earlier, this is the same thesis from earlier. In the address he gave to dedicate the statue, Obama used repetition, biblical references, and personal anecdotes to convey the power of her actions. Repetition, biblical references, and personal anecdotes are... Sorry, my mom's calling me. Are the rhetorical choices here. And convey the power of her actions is the common purpose, or the common effect. How do we find a common idea, purpose, or effect? How do we link together all the choices that we want to write about? Well, the easiest way to do this is to think about the author's purpose for writing, right? Remember the rhetorical situation? This is kind of how the rhetorical situation can help you with your essay, and how you can demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. The author's purpose specifically will a lot of times be a way of linking together all of the rhetorical choices. Even if all of the rhetorical choices that you've identified have kind of more like smaller, specific, different purposes, right? You might say, oh, well, the purpose of this rhetorical choice is to compare two things, right? Yes, definitely true. However, if you kind of like zoom out a little bit, most of the time, all of your rhetorical choices will in some way further the writer's main purpose, right? Even if, yes, the smaller purpose, the more specific, micro purpose of this choice is to compare two things. If we look at a larger scale, the reason why the author wants to compare those two things is because they are doing it to persuade you, right? Or they are doing it to help inform you, or something like that. If we think about the rhetorical situation and we think about the author's purpose, 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, we should be able to use that as our common idea, purpose, or effect. We don't have to, right? If we have some other way of linking together all our rhetorical choices, that's perfectly fine. But this is kind of a not foolproof, but nearly foolproof way of finding one. So let's do an activity here. Which thesis statement, specifically for the rhetorical analysis essay, is most effective here? Pause this video, read over the 5 options here, unpause when you've made a decision. Okay, A says the author uses analogies, hyperboles, and pathos. B says the author uses various rhetorical devices to persuade the audience that recycling is imperative. C says the author uses analogies, hyperbole, and pathos to persuade the audience that recycling is imperative. D says the author uses analogies to compare recycling to brushing your teeth, hyperbole to emphasize how long it takes plastic to decompose in landfills, and pathos to appeal to the audience's emotions. And D says the author makes rhetorical choices in his writing to create a certain effect. The best thesis statement here is C. And the reason it's C is because it does both of the things that we've talked about our thesis statement needing to do. It mentions our rhetorical choices and talks about how our rhetorical choices have some common goal, some common idea, purpose, or effect, right? The choices are analogies, hyperbole, and pathos, and the common idea, purpose, or effect is that all three of these choices persuade the audience that recycling is imperative. Let's talk about the issues with the other ones, though. A has our three rhetorical choices, but doesn't have any sort of effect or purpose or idea at all. B has the common idea, purpose, or effect, but doesn't list the rhetorical devices. It just says various rhetorical devices. D has all of our rhetorical devices and has effects or purposes, but they are the smaller effects or purposes, right? They are the individual effects and purposes of each of the choices. Analogies to compare recycling to brushing your teeth, hyperbole to emphasize how long it takes plastic to decompose, and pathos to appeal to the audience's emotions. Yeah, I'm sure each of these choices do those things, but we don't want that in our thesis statement. In our thesis statement, we only want the common idea, purpose, or effect, the larger scale purpose or effect. And then E doesn't say anything. The author makes rhetorical choices in his writing to create a certain effect. Yeah, I'm sure he does. But this tells me nothing about what the point of your paper is. What is the effect? And what are the rhetorical choices? That's what he needs. So yeah, C is the best option here. All right, let's practice. I am going to give you a set of rhetorical choices, 3 rhetorical choices. And I want you to find a common idea, purpose, or effect that links all 3 of them together, and then write a thesis statement. Now, in this case, we don't have a passage, right? We don't have a prompt. We don't know who the author is. We don't know what the purpose is. We don't know the rhetorical situation. So I'm giving you a little bit of leeway to make it up. Make up what you think the purpose might be of a passage that has these 3 rhetorical choices in it. Use your imagination. That's totally fine as long as it makes some sort of sense, right? You can't say that... you don't want to be like, okay, well, our choices are talking about self-driving cars and airplanes and research, so I'm going to say that the author's purpose is, or the author's message is about traveling under the sea, right? Obviously that doesn't make sense, but use a little imagination to kind of come up with something that could work with these pieces of evidence, or these choices, these rhetorical choices. Do your best, and I'll give you my example after you finish, after you unpause. Okay, so the common idea, purpose, or effect that I came up with here, let me read the choices first. Personification that prevents self-driving cars as if they are sentient, an analogy that compares self-driving cars to autopilot on an airplane, and ethos appeal by including data from a well-known research center. My common idea, purpose, or effect that all 3 of these choices share was something along the lines of persuading the audience that self-driving cars are safe, right? All 3 of these choices seem to be sharing that purpose. If we're presenting self-driving cars as if they're sentient, that could help explain why they're safe. Comparing self-driving cars to autopilot on an airplane could explain why they're safe, and then data from a well-known research center could also support that same purpose. That was my common purpose. And here's the thesis statement I wrote. Let me make this a little bit bigger. The author uses personification, analogies, and ethos to persuade readers that self-driving cars are safe and should be embraced by society. I have my rhetorical choices, and I have my common purpose. Yours doesn't have to be the same, but it should make sense, right? It should be something that all 3 of these rhetorical choices could share. So common ideas, purposes, and effects aren't just important for your thesis, right? That's where you're going to kind of directly state them. But you have to keep in mind, each of your body paragraphs is supposed to contain a claim that supports your thesis, right? The same way as the argument essay, you want claims in your body paragraphs that support your thesis. And if your thesis contains this common idea, purpose, and effect, then the body paragraphs also have to adapt to that, and the claims should also be related to that. So each body paragraph should include a discussion of how an individual rhetorical technique achieves the common idea, purpose, or effect. Since it's in your thesis statement, it needs to be present in your claims as well and in your body paragraphs as well. So you don't just want to talk about how the technique is used in the passage and where the technique is in the passage. You do want to talk about those things. You also want to tie it back to the common idea, purpose, or effect. So if we look at this example essay that we were looking at earlier about Obama and Rosa Parks, we know that the common idea, purpose, or effect is that Obama is using these three choices to convey the power of Rosa Parks' actions. Let's read this body paragraph now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Perhaps President Obama's most notable rhetorical choice is the repetition used throughout his speech. Okay, so we're talking about this first one now, the repetition. In the third paragraph of his speech, he says, Rosa Parks would not be pushed. She would not be pushed. I'm assuming that says pushed. A little hard to read the handwriting. He uses this repetition to stress Rosa Parks' determination in the face of arrest while he tells the famous story of her refusing to move on the bus. In addition, in lines 34 to 35, while discussing the determination of the boycotters, Obama says, walking for respect, walking for freedom. This repetition not only stresses the fact that many boycotters walked miles through harsh conditions, as he previously mentioned in the same paragraph, but further emphasizes the words freedom and respect. This is important because it calls attention to the basic human decencies these people, especially Rosa Parks, fought for with such persistence. Okay, so does this paragraph talk about how the repetition conveys the power of Rosa Parks' actions? Yes. He uses this repetition to stress Rosa Parks' determination in the face of arrest. That conveys the power of her actions, right? And then also at the end, the emphasis is important because it calls attention to the basic human decencies these people, especially Rosa Parks, fought for. Both of these pieces of evidence that he mentions, he kind of relates back to how it conveys the power of Rosa Parks' actions. So you want to make sure you're doing that same thing as well in your body paragraphs. You need to, in some way, relate the rhetorical choice to the common idea, purpose, or effect. In addition to kind of giving specific examples from the passage, right? That's where your evidence is going to come from. You do want these, they don't have to necessarily be quotes, they can be paraphrases, but you want to point out specific parts of the passage that use that rhetorical choice. Okay, so that is rhetorical choices. That is kind of enough of our, what am I trying to say here? Let me start over. That's kind of it for today as far as things that are specific to the rhetorical analysis essay, right? Everything we've talked about up until this point is specific to the rhetorical analysis essay. None of this is going to come into play on the argument or the synthesis essay, except for the fact that if you want to use rhetorical devices or rhetorical strategies in your own writing. Obviously, you can use them in your own writing on those other two essays. But as far as identifying them in passages and things like that, that is only for the rhetorical analysis essay. Same thing with common ideas, purposes, or effects, only for the rhetorical analysis essay. Sophistication and style is for all of the essays. It's a point on the rubric of all three essays. So what we're about to talk about, don't compartmentalize it just into rhetorical analysis. It applies to all of them. So we've talked about sophistication a bunch. I don't want to say we've talked about it a bunch. We've mentioned it a bunch. We haven't talked about it much at all. Now is the time to talk about it. And essentially, the rubric has two things that it mentions that you are supposed to demonstrate. You're supposed to demonstrate sophistication of thought, and you are supposed to write in a vivid and persuasive style. What do these mean? Well, we've talked about persuasive a little bit. And persuasive in this case can also mean convincing. Because the rhetorical analysis essay, we talked about how it's not necessarily persuasive, it's more convincing. They're kind of used interchangeably in this case, persuasive or convincing, but also vivid. What does this mean? And how do we achieve this? Well, there's a couple of ways to achieve this. Some of the ways we can achieve this are things we've already discussed. Some ways to demonstrate sophistication of thought are through use of strong, specific diction and syntax, choosing words and phrases that are direct, clear, straightforward, avoiding vague words. We talked about this with persuasiveness, right? This helps with your sophistication. Opposing viewpoints are another way to write a more sophisticated essay, to demonstrate sophistication of thought. Specifically for the argument and synthesis essays, right? Not for the rhetorical analysis essay, but for those other two essays, if you address an opposing viewpoint, you can strengthen your own argument that way. And by kind of addressing the limitations of your argument, that makes your writing more sophisticated. Rhetorical appeals as well, another thing we've talked about. This mostly applies to argument and synthesis essay rather than rhetorical analysis, but yeah, using these rhetorical appeals, ethos, logos, pathos, can make your writing more persuasive and therefore more sophisticated. Rhetorical situation, which we talked about today, demonstrating an understanding of that rhetorical situation, writing for your audience, making smart choices for your purpose. That's another way to write with sophistication. And using rhetorical devices and strategies, which we talked about earlier, can make your writing more sophisticated, can demonstrate sophistication of thought.